So thank you very, very much for joining our first webinar of 2023. So happy new year to you all. So today we will be talking about the environmental impacts of drug production. So I think we will begin then. And we have our two expert guests with us, David Rodriguez Goyes and Nigel South. I'll start with David though. So David, welcome. Thank you very, very much for this. And calling from Oslo, is that correct?
Yeah, from Oslo. Thanks for having me.
So yeah, many thanks for coming on. So if you could please perhaps tell us a bit about yourself, what you do with yourself, what your most relevant research has been for here, and maybe some of your key agendas on this issue.
Yeah, thanks. So first, I want to say that I am Colombian, right? So I lived for the first 26 years of my life in Colombia. And now I'm a researcher at the Department of Criminology and Sociology of Law at the University of Oslo. And although my field of research has never been drugs, all my research projects and all my professional activity has been informed by the topic of drugs. First, because I'm Colombian, I research a lot on Colombian and Latin American issues, but also because it seems like drugs are intertwined with many of the topics that I have been researching. So what I want to present today is a combination of the empirical information and all the insights that I have gotten along my career. The first part of the first source of information will be my participation in the Colombian peace process in 2012 between the FARC guerrillas and the Colombian government, right? So that will be one source of information, but also together with Nigel and with our colleagues, we have been conducting these research projects with indigenous communities, and that has given us also a kind of a good overview over their situation when it comes to the issue of drugs. Also, I conducted with my colleague Katia Franco this project about hierarchies of victimhood, memory, trauma. What's the name for that? I forgot it. But anyways, it's how the representations of Colombian society in Netflix through Narcos affect Colombian society. And of course, that has a lot to do with drug groups, drug cartels, and so on. And the final part, kind of the final project from where I'm going to be drawing inspiration, is my current research together with other colleagues in Oslo, including Sveinung Sandberg. We have been interviewing 300 inmates in 6 Latin American countries. And one of the offenses for which we have selected the participants has been drug trafficking. So we have, what I'm going to try to do here is to bring about this combination of perspectives. I want to combine the perspective of the indigenous people, who are usually the most affected by drug wars and drug issues. I want to also bring here the perspective of civil society, which was represented in the Colombian peace process. And I also want to bring here the perspective of the perpetrator, of those who run the business, those who control the territories, those who make sure that the demand is satisfied, that they keep producing and trafficking with drugs. So by combining these sources of information, what I want to highlight in my participation is this link, that what I want to say is that drugs is one of the links between genocide and ecocide. So kind of a summary is something like that, that first, to produce drugs, to be able to traffic, you have to take control over territories. That's a first interaction between drug trafficking and nature. It's what others have termed the extractions, right? So you have to extract from nature the drugs, which are the resources to be trafficked. And then to take control over territories, you also have to take control over the people that live in there, right? Both because you need the territories where they that they inhabit, and also because you can use them as workforce, right? So in that combination, in that interaction between drug cartels, drug traffickers, and inhabitants, they end up with three impacts. First, they destroy the ecosystems, because what they do is to replace the nature, kind of the original ecosystems and the crops that the indigenous communities had, or the rural inhabitants had. First, they also destroy cultures, because they replace the cultures of the original inhabitants with the cultures or the logics that the traffickers want to impose. And then, of course, they also, along the way, they commit a genocide, in the sense that they are directly or physically killing people, but at the same time, they are killing the cultures, or murdering the cultures of the indigenous inhabitants of those territories. So in that sense, they are producing a genocide. And as we know, and Nigel has written and others have written, this genocide is conducive to ecocide as well. When you replace a culture that is usually respectful of nature, that has a bit more healthier and more respectful relationships to nature, what you do is to eliminate the protectors of ecosystems of nature. So that's the kind of the general ideas. I want to tell three brief stories to illustrate each of these points that I'm making, each of the perspectives that I want to bring to the table. So the first perspective I want to take is the perspective of the indigenous. And the first story comes from the Amazon. I was living in the Amazon a decade ago, probably, or perhaps more. And that was in the border between Colombia, Peru, and Brazil. And I was living with this indigenous community. They were hosting us, and what they do is it's called mambeo. So they, out of the plant coca combined with other elements, they produce this powder that they put in the mouth, and they use that whenever they are going to have their most important meetings, because that it's not cocaine, but it's a way of getting extra energy to think through the most important issues that the community wants to discuss. We knew about that, but when we were visiting, I was with some friends from my university. One of those guys asked the leader of the community, "Can I try mambe? Can I do what you're doing?" And then the leader of the community was immediately offended. He said, "This is very disrespectful of you. Using this plant is sacred to us. We adore this plant as a goddess." And we could see a statue of coca as a goddess of the community. So that's to say that coca, the plant, has a deep spiritual and cultural meaning to indigenous communities. At the end, after staying with them many days, I was offered to try that, but that was after a long process. And that's part of their cultural tissue, the plant coca in itself. Then I want to go to my second story. I want to forward until last year, when I received some messages from an indigenous person living in Colombia as well, in Cauca. And she was very distressed. What she was saying is that they are killing us. They are threatening my family. They are displacing people. And then when I asked who those people were, she said, those are the drug traffickers. They are killing my community. They are taking over the lands because all they want to do is to replace our crops with coca crops, with coca plantations, and they want to force us to crop coca. So that's the view from the indigenous people, how they see that their territories are being destroyed to produce drugs. Then when we get the view of the perpetrator, this is one of the interviews that we conducted recently in prison a couple months ago. And the person we interviewed was actually one of the leaders of the paramilitaries, which have a very strong connection with drug cartels. And he explained in detail how they go forward in producing this. And what he said is that he was in charge of two regions, two departments in Colombia, and that he had to make sure that everyone in the hamlets and towns in those territories, they were complying with his instructions. And the instructions were either you obey and replace your crops with what we do, or you leave the territory, or we kill you, right? And for that, he had his army, and he had this very clear structure in which he ensured that enough drugs were produced to be trafficked. And if there are questions, I can always expand on how he operated, but I want to go to the perhaps third and final story of what I want to say, and that was the peace process in 2012. This was the first peace process in which both issues, that of land redistribution and the issue of criminalized drugs, were treated together, right? Before, drugs were not seen as a problem related to the Colombian war, but it was thought that it was just a political issue that had nothing to do with drug trafficking. And the agenda included both land redistribution and criminalized drugs, because it was civil society that was consulted, and all came with 6 points of the agenda, and these two were together. And what they were saying is that they are taking over our lands, they are destroying our ecosystems to produce drugs. So we are no longer we're not longer in control of our territories. We are not doing what we used to do, the way we used to relate to nature, because now the only thing that happens is deforestation to produce, to have coca crops. And they also said we should not be talking about illicit drugs, illegal drugs, as it was suggested by the government. It should be, the denomination should be criminalized plants, because these are part of our culture, but we produce them in a way that is respectful of nature. We have a different relation. So it's not that they are bad in themselves, it's bad in the way they are being produced and in the way they are connected to the destruction of nature. So basically what all three stories point to is that there's this clear connection between drug trafficking, the murder of people, indigenous people mainly, which is in a way genocide, and how that genocide also contributes to ecocide. So there's this kind of interaction between the two concepts, being drug trafficking part of the link between the one and the other, genocide and ecocide.
That is fantastic, David. Thank you very much. The research you do in the Amazon with indigenous people sounds absolutely incredible, and I do hope we get more questions about that later on. One question I'm going to put you on the spot for before I hand over to Nigel, about the concept ecocide. It's quite new to me. I'm not sure I'd heard it until a chance meeting when I was on a flight to New York, and me and the person next to each other asked what we were doing there, and she was a member high up, if not the founder of a charity called Stop Ecocide, and she was on her way to New York to try and have ecocide and genocide put on the same footing during the United Nations week last September. So can you please just tell us what ecocide is and what your definition would be, and perhaps how you see it as a relation to genocide?
Yeah, so of course Nigel can provide a more accurate definition, since he has been writing about this for a long time. But basically, ecocide is the almost irreversible destruction of large parts of nature. That's what it refers to. It's not just kind of one non-human animal here or one small part of the territory here, but it's kind of a broader part of ecosystems that it's quite difficult to reverse its destruction. So it refers to this mass destruction of nature, and that's the connection that it has with genocide. It's the same logic. It's not, it doesn't focus on an individual, but it focuses more on the mass, large-scale destruction of something which is difficult to reverse, and that's the same meaning of genocide. No, genocide is kind of the murder of an ethnic group, either by physical force or by cultural dynamics, that is difficult to reverse. So that those are kind of those are two major forces of destructions of nature and of culture.
That's awesome. Thank you very, very much. So now I will bring in Nigel. So Nigel, thank you very, very much for joining us here. I presume you are calling in from home in Essex, I guess?
Yep, here in Colchester.
Oh, in Colchester, great. So we've got like Oslo, Manchester, Colchester, sitting in the room at the moment. Although I'm visiting, I'm just in a hotel room, as you might be able to tell from my background. So Nigel, many thanks for joining us here. And I believe you have got some slides you'll share for your bit here.
Yeah, I'll move on to those. So, you want me to just get going?
Yeah. So if you could, introduce yourself and tell us about your background regarding these sorts of issues, some research you have done, your key agendas, or whatever you've prepared on your slides.
Okay, well, been around a while, so it could take some time. Worked through the 1980s in what was then called the Institute for the Study of Drug Dependence, and the focus of drugs research then was very transatlantic, very global north, very Western orientated, and yeah, I've maintained that kind of interest over time, but also became interested in crimes against the environment, against nature, and some of the examples of exploitation around the world that then begins to focus one's attention on the global south and non-Western spaces of harm and damage. It's quite interesting that quite a few people, including Gary, have also had an interest in both drugs and environmental issues, and they can see connections about the issues involved, the power players involved, the markets involved, and so on. And Boukert van Solange in the Netherlands has also made this jump. Worked at the University of Essex for many years and just retired recently, but still researching. As I say, when I did start to look at other issues in the global south, I did some work on biopiracy, about exploitation of resources in Latin America, and subsequently met David, from whom I have learned an enormous amount about the issues of research in threatened communities, particularly indigenous communities in Latin America. And that's been the focus of some of our attention in some recent projects that we might be able to touch on later. And you asked me to talk about green criminology, which is very simply defined as a criminology that pays attention to the crimes and harms affecting the environment. And David might want to say something a bit later about the development he's been pushing forward here, which is the idea of a southern green criminology, which very much connects to what we're talking about today. And just related to all of that and your transatlantic flight with somebody going to argue at the United Nations, I think you said about ecocide, the issue there is that although, as David says, it's in a way a parallel concept to genocide and traces its origin to the work of Raphael Lemkin, who was the originator of thinking about genocide. Genocide is, of course, recognized in international law through the Rome Statute and the International Criminal Court, whereas at the moment ecocide isn't. And that's what the campaigning has been about. And it was the late Polly Higgins who was the pioneer Other people have written about the idea of a genocide or of an ecocide or a geocide or other ideas, but it was only Polly Higgins, who was a British barrister, was Scottish originally, who really pushed for this and sadly died well before her time a few years ago. But that's what the campaign is still going forward from. So if I move on to my remarks, as David said, you can look at some drugs, coca, opium and others, from the point of view of the global south and various cultures that will place the properties and the histories and traditions surrounding these drugs at the center of a cultural mythology or belief system or whatever. And Ross Coomer and I edited a book about this some years ago, which I can refer people to if they want. But in the global north, drugs are well known about. Drugs are cultural wallpaper, but largely as commodities. And people don't really think about where they come from or how they are produced. And they read about trafficking, and they hear occasionally politicians berating cocaine sniffers in Hampstead parties and things like that. But of course, there's a whole hidden world there. And so the two obvious key starting points that are neglected are, given what's involved, both large-scale cultivation and large-scale destruction of drugs are not good for the environment. Pretty obvious. A lot of law enforcement involved, a lot of chemicals involved, and so on. But the destruction, the second point, the destruction is largely driven by supply reduction. And the real problem is demand. So supply reduction drives destruction, which is largely affecting the global south, particularly Latin America. The real problem is demand in the global north. Okay, if I try and move to some points there that you can see the screen, yeah, which just tries to be go back, topical, just by saying, well, there's two current sources of context for what we're talking about, because partly what we're talking about is the casualty of a drug war. And it's just to remind us that wars are not good for the environment. And at the moment, what's happening in the Ukraine has produced quite a lot of evidence about, as if we needed it, about the destructive effects of wars on the environment. Nature and the environment are the silent victims in wars. Doug Weir is being quoted by many newspapers about the way in which wars destroy habitats, kill wildlife, generate pollution, remake ecosystems entirely. That's been happening in Latin America and other parts of the world through the drug war for many years. At the moment, it's on front pages or in quality press reports because of what's happening in Ukraine. There's also some topicality in relation to Colombia, which has been the focus of quite a lot of both law enforcement attention from the American war on drugs, as well as research attention because of the change in presidential leadership and the election of Gustavo Petro, who has drawn attention to, as part of his campaign and since taking office, the destruction and the deaths that have followed the war on drugs in Latin America and elsewhere. So he's hoping that he and his government can lead Colombia away from the kind of drug war politics that particularly the United States, but also other countries have been leading globally as the strategy to direct against drugs. As I say, a strategy against drug cultivation rather than a strategy really looking at global north demand. And you asked about green criminology. Well, I think it's quite a central issue, set of issues here, because criminology is very transatlantic. At least, here we are in the UK. From the UK's point of view, or Western Europe's point of view, or the United States, which is very parochial and provincial, really, criminology has amnesia about most of the rest of the world and the kinds of issues that we should be studying. As I say, David's been combining this whole new emphasis on Southern criminology with green criminology to develop a Southern green criminology perspective. And although the war on drugs has not been neglected in criminology or political economy, it really has been neglected in terms of the legacy, the power of the legacy of the war on drugs and its continuation in terms of its impact on politics and drugs, impact on policies and economies through to today. David's mentioned the impact on Indigenous people. They are perhaps the greatest hidden victims, but there's also a strong tradition in Latin American criminology, much of it, of course, in Spanish or Portuguese, but quite a lot in English, that has drawn attention to these issues that's simply been largely ignored by Western criminology, global Northern criminology. And the person I've really been championing in recent years is a pioneering Latin American criminologist from Venezuela originally, Rosa del Olmo, who you were talking about the idea of ecocide earlier, coined what I still think is a fantastic term in her essay produced in 1987. This is the essay Aerobiology and the War on Drugs. And she coined the term eco-biogenocide to describe what was happening under the Reagan administration and the war on drugs in Latin America. And she was drawing attention to what she saw as a crime against humanity committed by the United States with the complicity of the Colombian government, involving the state. So it's a state crime, it's a corporate crime involving manufacturers of glyphosate and other similar deadly, very harmful pesticides, herbicides, pesticides and so on, that have known deadly health and eco harms, but were and are used fairly indiscriminately around the world. And she had this early application of the concept of ecocide, developing this idea of eco-biogenocide, which captures the impact on Indigenous people, their victims, weak, powerless victim status, the impact on the ecology, the impact on the biosphere. You're using pesticides that seep into the water table. They have population implications. They have ecosystem implications. So Del Olmo back in 1987 was saying drug crop eradication should be seen as the equivalent of a crime which has the characteristics of ecocide, making war and so on. So she was actually a pioneer in even thinking about this idea of ecocide in relation to human rights and the war on drugs and the environment. Now, again, we can look at other literatures, and this is really a field where being interdisciplinary really is very attractive and necessary. So others have written about, from the point of view of looking at colonial history, the contemporary climate emergency we can directly trace back to colonial activities. And it's those colonial routes of exploitation that exploited Indigenous peoples and first gave rise to what became the drug trades around the world, in particular the British, the French, the Dutch, were the first major international traffickers producing opium, coke, cannabis, and so on. And they're all plant-based drugs. And they left legacies of production. So come the time of prohibition, we have, as Del Olmo points out, two sides of a problem to be considered. First, the ecological impact of drug production itself, and second, the ecological impact of drug distribution, of drug destruction, although distribution, I guess, has ecological impacts as well, because it's about clearing forests for roads, airplanes, and so on. So several directions and questions follow. So some writers have talked about narco-trafficking as a cause of narco-degradation. Forms of land use change will also intermingle with other kinds of exploitation of nature, organised crimes, wildlife trades, illegal logging. And our colleague Dan Van Oom has done quite a bit of work on the intermingling of these markets, quite profound intermingling, which of course are underpinned by corruption and so on. All of this means a lot of money, a lot of power, undermines conservation governance, and means that there's, from the power of money through to the power of the gun, small holdings, cooperatives, people are pushed out. It's one of the anecdotes that David had there. You're either with us or you're not with us or you're dead, basically. But Sweeney's written quite a bit on this, saying when drug crop cultivation moves into fragile ecosystems, ecological damage extends to environmental contamination. There's perverse harms to the natural environment. Drug crop eradication drives deforestation because it doesn't just simply occur as an event. Of course, the drug economy continues, the pressures to continue producing continue, the demand continues. So drug farmers are displaced, they displace their activity to new, perhaps more remote environments. So you're then damaging further the more so far untouched, pristine parts of the forest, the jungle. And so you have this cycle of enforcement attempts which push cultivators and traffickers into destructive further biodiverse habitats. And there's some interesting global international tensions that are really quite depressing here. So you've got, on the one hand, support for drug supply and eradication being part of the remit, part of the core mission of the UNODC and the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs. All of that, of course, works in direct opposition to other UN missions, declarations, and so on about protecting biodiversity, securing ecosystem services, ensuring rights of Indigenous people, mitigating climate change, promoting sustainable development, SDGs, and so on. So you have these global forces saying, here are our missions, but their intention, and it's not new or unique. I've drawn attention to it elsewhere, where you've got the World Trade Organization, which has basically a mission to promote growth, economic growth, perennial, non-sustainable growth, working alongside UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme, which is about sustainability. And they, at some point a few years ago, celebrated some anniversary with a joint platform saying how closely they were working together. Well, their missions are incompatible, so it's kind of a strange world. David and I and others have tried to draw attention to the, as I say, the intermingling of some of this, because it's not just about drugs, it's about power, it's about economies, it's about the way in which many countries in Latin America or across Asia and so on have been used in a continuing colonialism. It's not post-colonialism, it's continuing colonialism. And all of this, of course, in terms of the climate change debate, is making significant contributions to the warming of the planet. It's not just about local impacts, it's about global impacts. So you can't even say, oh, well, it's just happening over there, somewhere else, it's not a problem. It's a global problem because it's hitting, it's impacting on the environment, that in turn accelerates climate change. Del Olmo was saying both drug production, drug crop destruction are important global issues, but it's the latter that poses most questions, crop destruction, because she says this was about indifference of governments towards the major environmental and human health problems which pesticide use and misuse produce. And she wrote that in 1997, I think. So, you know, in conclusion, do we now have greater awareness of the impact of pesticides and herbicides and so on? Well, I think the other day, the British government, no longer bound by European rules, gave the approval for use of a pesticide that's a chemical of some sort that's insect repellent, that's now banned in the European Union, but gave permission for it to be used in sugar beet farming in East Anglia. So we're not really listening there. Yeah, I was going to give another example, but 2022 last year was the 60th anniversary of the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which was the major text that really shook up the world to alert them. For those who don't know, Rachel Carson was an ecologist and biologist and a woman. She really upset the male scientific establishment with this best-selling book that was very powerful. President Kennedy was full of praise for it, drawing attention to the impact of pesticides on intensive farming, killing wildlife, killing birds. Silent Spring refers to the impact of the pesticides on the bird population. And for those of you who like Joni Mitchell, then Big Yellow Taxi gives a nod to this. It's in Joni Mitchell's lyrics about farmer, throw away the DDT now. So do we have greater awareness about the impact of pesticides? Well, we have greater awareness, but do we listen? Not really sure. And we do certainly have greater awareness about the fragility of delicate state of ecosystems. But again, this is one of the kind of things that's easily overlooked in terms of deforestation, because we do get worried about the clearing of forest lands, and we can see from the aerial photographs and so on across Asia and across Latin America how both big agricultural interests but also drugs cultivation has cleared parts of forest, cleared parts of jungle. One of the things that is overlooked, because it's kind of science or biology or whatever, is every time you create one of these fragmentations, you're creating a new outside, you're creating a new external wall, you're creating a new periphery. That constant fragmentation is very, very damaging to the fragility of the ecosystem, because you're constantly disrupting it. You're breaking up the canopy. You're creating new walls. Walls are vulnerable. External facing walls are vulnerable. And also post-COVID, we now ought to be more aware of walls are more permeable. Exteriors are more permeable. We ought to be more aware of the fact, or wary about the fact, that there are viruses out there in the ecosystems of the world that are, whilst they're not transmitted to humans, or whilst they're contained in their own particular environments, are not globally created global pandemics. The more we push into these areas, the more we make them permeable, the more, to be human-centered, the more humanity is doing itself a serious risk disfavor, because we open up more risk of encountering these viruses. And that's apart from the damage we do to the ecosystems, indigenous people, the climate, global warming, and so on. So I'll finish there.
That was awesome. Thank you very much, Nigel. That left no stones unturned for me to give you a follow-up. But there's actually a couple of good questions we already had, which I think would serve as quite good follow-ups. So I think what I'll do is I'll read out these two questions. And then I think I'll allow both David and then Nigel to have a bite of the apples, which I'm just about to serve up. So I just need to open the chat. So here we are. So the first question I saw was from Carl Cyril. And so he said, when I hear these kind of stories, I think these are the stories that David was telling earlier. I'm surprised how it's always the fault of the drug traffickers. Would regulation help to combat illegal growing, harvesting of coca, or create a way that is less harmful to the environment? In the Netherlands, for example, drug waste from MDMA production often gets dumped in nature. This costs a lot of money to clean up. If the money was used to allow free anonymous drop sites for the chemicals are treated safely, we could dispose of all Dutch drug production waste. So hold that one in your mind. And there's a similar good point from Eva. She says, question for David, but all panelists welcome to contribute. Thank you so much for your insights, David. Your research sounds fascinating. It is painful to hear about the incredible deleterious effects of cocaine production, and I am wondering where we go from here. Do you have any opinions on what the best way to move forward and protect the environment and indigenous cultures? Would decriminalisation or legalisation help? Or is it fair to argue that many legal industries also destroy indigenous culture and the environment, such as oil, lithium, energy industries, and some crop foods? How do we reckon with the demand for cocaine worldwide, which is unlikely to dissipate anytime soon and has been broadly unaffected by the current strategy of criminalisation? So I hope you can hold some of those points. So do cherry pick your favourite points from Carl, Cyril, and Eva. And so first, David, then Nigel, let us know if you have any thoughts on those comments and questions.
Well, I guess I can start just with the first part of Carl's question, right? Because it had two parts. And this is, of course, a brilliant question as well, because what I was trying to do was to present a more local perspective of the issue, right? So I was talking about Colombian indigenous peoples, I was talking about Colombian drug traffickers and the Colombian civil society. But then, of course, we have to connect this, complement this with what Nigel was presenting. The issue of drug trafficking and the harms in drug production is a very complex issue where there are many actors. So what I want to highlight here is that we cannot just blame the drug traffickers, because there are many other actors here. This is a complex, very, very complex system. So of course we have, as Nigel was saying, we have the demand, and a lot of the drugs produced in the global south go to the global north. And that means that it's not only the traffickers supplying these drugs, but it's also, we also have to think, as Nigel said, about the consumers, the consumer countries and individuals. So that's another factor there. But we also have to think about politicians on political and economic elites in the production sites as well, because it's not easy to differentiate between drug traffickers and politicians and political and economic elites. There's lots of research on also judicial processes that show the interlinking between politicians and drug cartels and paramilitaries. So this is not just these individual traffickers who are the problem, it's also in the system of the corruption as well. So we have demand, consumers, we have politicians, we have elites, but we also have in general, and this question is so good because it allows me to say a bit more about the complexity of the issue now. And if we think, for instance, just about the traffickers, the drug traffickers, then it's not like all the traffickers are the same, right? So we cannot just put them in one box. Out of this research with people in prison, we have interviewed several people who have been part of this drug trafficking. And the example that I brought here was from one person who was born in the countryside of Colombia, was part of, he was born in this very poor family. There was a lot of violence around him, and the way he found to survive was to join this paramilitary organization, and from there on he ascended, if we can call it that, to drug trafficking, and then he was the leader at some point. So in that sense, we also have to include as an actor or as a factor here in this issue, the structures, the marginalization, the lack of opportunities. So it's far from being just the traffickers. This is a complex system that, you know, nourishes drug trafficking, and in the way it's destroying nature, is generating this ecosystem. So I think that connects a little bit with the second part of Carl's question as well, which is about regulation. And then once we understand that this is a very complex issue where there are many actors, and where also the politicians, the elites, the political and economic elites are part of the issue, then regulation alone does not seem too promising. What we see in Colombia, at least, and also many other Latin American countries, is the co-option of the government. And that means also the co-option of the Congress. And that means the possibility to influence lawmaking and law implementation in the ways they want. So just regulation in that sense alone would not help in this case, because it is such a complex issue. I think I'll stop there, and then perhaps I will answer to Eva's question, but I'll give the word to Nigel if he wants.
So yeah, Nigel, I don't know if you have any follow-up on David's points there relating to the questions I read from earlier.
Which bit of the question are we trying to do?
Good question. I asked two very long triple-barreled questions, so there was an awful lot to chew on there. But I guess something about the tangling of the problems, whether, so we've got another one as well. I'll actually, what I'll do is I'll read another question which is along similar lines to what David was saying. That might be a good place for you to go to. D. Ganderton Smith says, would legalization of drugs be a positive step in environmental harms? It could mean the beginnings of a legislative framework with governmental oversight. This might in time lead to more sustainable growing techniques, fairer distribution of wealth, decreased risk local populations and consumers, also remove a massive income stream from criminal factions who are not bound by laws or morals. So I think, you know, David's somewhat answered that. We're saying it's a very complex question there. I don't know if you've got any more on this, Nigel.
Yeah. As I say, I've been working in the drugs field since 1980. And so the question of legalization or decriminalization is one we've been through quite a lot. And in principle, you know, there are ways forward. Even though, as David said, and we all know this is, and I've tried to indicate, the roots of the current drugs market global are deep-rooted, and as a market, obviously, recreational use of drugs goes back centuries, civilizations, blah, blah, blah. But as a profitable commodity, it's deep-rooted in economic systems, the history of colonialism, etc., and so on. So it's not, as David was saying, it's not straightforward. Drugs are, unless you're talking about homegrown and not-for-profit exchange, social supply types of arrangements, generally there's profit involved. And if you've got profit involved, that distorts whatever happens next. If you are, I'm not saying these are impossible routes, but you know, sometimes people have very straightforward notions. And there's a fantastic reformer in the field, Ethan Nadelman, Drug Policy Alliance in the States. I used to have this argument with Ethan. My starting point would be, okay, well, let's look at history. And Ethan had his responses, you know, let's look at history and the kinds of products that might be parallel: rubber, tobacco, oil. I think somebody mentioned oil. How did they fare in terms of who were beneficiaries of these trades? What happened to the places that were producing them? Is it a good story? And by and large, no. In the 19th, 18th, 19th century involved slavery, in the 20th century and 21st century involves pollution, and so on. So, you know, there's some bad things there. On the other hand, as often been said in relation to Colombia and one or two other Latin American countries, if part of your major resource is the ability to produce these miraculous products of nature, why can't these countries capitalize on that? You know, why can't there be a better market for medical cannabis or medical cocaine, or indeed for certain kinds of recreational forms of cocaine or other drugs? And I think, you know, some Latin American think tanks and politicians and others have been trying to think through the market for this for some time, and David might have more up-to-date notions about this. Again, back to working in this field for years and years, I never expected that it would be the United States that would be one of the leading places to have cannabis shops on the high street. You know, this is the land of Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, war on drugs, 3 strikes and you're out, throw people in jail, throw away the key. I just never expected to see that kind of. It's still federally not allowed, but statewide it's changing. And so, you know, I'm not saying change doesn't happen, and it does. How you regulate that? I mean, a lot of people are looking at Canada, looking at what's happening in the States, and the different states, California versus others, are having different outcomes. But one of the points there was about, well, you know, if you had government oversight, could this lead to a better sort of market? Well, one thing governments would be interested in would be taxation. You know, an Oz magazine back in the 60s used to run stories about the big tobacco companies patenting, as they probably did, names for cannabis tobacco products in the expectation that you know, the hippie revolution would lead to legalization of marijuana or something. Of course, as we find with vaping, big tobacco would like this, exchequers would like this. Whether I trust in competent governments like ours to oversee anything very effectively, I really don't know. But I don't know. I think there are possibilities. Certainly, there's that complexity that both David and I have talked about and that drive drugs production, drug markets, isn't going to go away. So yes, the future remains open.
Thank you very much for that, Nigel. So there's a question from Mafalda Pardal I want to ask, but before I get to that, David, do you have any follow-up from the follow-up we've just heard from Nigel?
Yes, I do. And I want to also mention something because I think it connects with the question that Eva asked, right? I don't know if it's necessary to read it, but she was also comparing the situation with the drug production and other types of production in the global south. And I think we have many similar dynamics here. And this is something that both Nigel and other participants have commented on the chat, right? It's not only coca production that is destroying ecosystems in Latin America, but it's also the production of many other items for consumption in the global north, especially because there's a lot of exports from Latin America to Europe, the US, etc. And that's why part of the proposal and part of the discussion also within the work that Nigel and I have developed is to look at this world divides. And he mentioned Southern green criminology, and it is about looking at the inequitable distribution of harms and goods in the world. So it's very similar what happens in the production of legal products, legal crops, compared to the production of drugs. It's about land grabbing, it is about the destruction of ecosystem, it's about the imposition of cropping practices. It is about also the use of all these chemicals that Nigel was mentioning and someone in the chat was also mentioning. So it's not only this the crop reduction programs, but we also do that in a legal manner when it comes to other edibles, for instance. So yeah, there's always been this selectivity of the penal system, what is chosen to be criminalized or not, and then we have this parallel between legal and illegal products that run the same line, and one of those parallels is again that divide between what we can call conceptually the global north and the global south, and how most of the harms in the production are lived in the global south, and how many of the benefits from those products are experienced by the global north. Of course, this is a bit more complex than that, but that's just a conceptualization and a generalization. And that connects with what would happen if we were to allow different types of drugs, if countries in the global south were to profit or try to profit from these crops and so on. And I want to bring the attention to the work of a colleague whose name is Irene Vélez Torres. She is currently the Minister of Mines and Energy in Colombia, appointed by Petro, but she participated in this event some years ago in Bogota, and she presented this article that you can now find in Critical Criminology called Medicinal Marijuana Inc., a critique on the market-led legalization of cannabis and the criminalization of rural livelihoods in Colombia. So basically what she's saying here is, yes, we tried in Colombia to make it legal to allow to commercialize marijuana, but what happened as usual is that the economic structures are in place, and then the business is taken over by the industries, by the economic elites, and then the rural inhabitants are then again displaced, their lands are taken. So we have these very strong economic and political structures behind everything that we do, and that's what makes so complex finding an answer to these issues.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you. And I guess a key message I'm getting is, whereas the law may be harmful and inadequate in many ways, I guess it's capitalism and human insatiability for ever more things and consumption might sit at the root, as well as strong focus on how global inequalities direct where the problems and the benefits of many things tend to have in common. I will now have a slight thematic switch. So I'll go to the question from Mafalda. I'd also say it's great to have Mafalda Pardal asking a question, as she, about right in the middle of COVID lockdowns, she was one of our expert guests, bringing her expertise about cannabis social clubs on a cannabis special we had with Mafalda and also Marcos Boldin from Uruguay. So thank you, Mafalda, for joining, and thank you very much for asking this question. So maybe I'll put this one to Nigel first and then to David, and this actually chimes with one of the bullet points from the flyer, which we haven't got around to yet, so very good timing. Could you share your thoughts on how we might improve current understanding and assessment of environmental harms associated with drug production and waste? So yeah, speaks to, I guess, a lot of how do you measure this? How can we measure the extent and the extent and nature and locations of the harm that's happening? So I don't know, Nigel, if you have anything on that?
Well, you probably need specialists to answer that. Depends what the location is and what kind of production. I saw somewhere in chat people were talking about production of synthetic drugs in Netherlands or somewhere, and the logistics of geographies and policing and detection would be different in the Netherlands to the middle of the Amazon or something. Both involve chemicals, so forensic and chemists would probably have similar techniques. I really don't know that I'm qualified to talk in any detail about this. In terms of chemical signatures for drugs, obviously that's one of the things that law enforcement have developed as a technique for investigation over the years. In the 1980s, it was an innovation to be going for precursor to trying to track production or refining of drugs, whether synthetic or processing plant drugs for recreational purposes or sale, by charting the sale and route of precursor chemicals, which relies on intelligence and informants and paper-based and computer-based detection. So again, it's a complex kind of field. So if you had a police officer here and you had a chemist here and you had a forensic scientist and a biologist, they might be able to offer a better answer, but David might know more.
Yeah, over to you, David.
Yeah, I think like as Nigel was saying, it depends a little bit on your interest and your perspective. I can talk about my perspective on what we have been trying to do with Southern Green Criminology, right? Because part of that proposal or the agenda there is also to rely on the expertise of local people, those who are usually sidelined or neglected in the production of knowledge. And this is the way we have proceeded in several of the projects we have had with Nigel and with our colleagues, and that is a close cooperation with indigenous communities. Because if we are talking here, as Mafalda writes, about understanding and assessing environmental harms associated with drug production and drug waste, so I think indigenous communities have a lot of expertise in different ways. First, because they are the ones who are living closer to the locations of production and also the places where waste is discarded. So they have the kind of empirical expertise in terms of observing changes in their surroundings, in their natural environments. And that's very much this is part of the decolonial agenda. This is part of what Boaventura Santos Sousa was proposing about not just relying on science, kind of Western science understood that way, but also relying on the expertise of the people who have to notice these changes to survive, right? So that's one part, but also I think the second part, which could be important by using this approach, the approach of the chatting with the indigenous communities and learning from them, exchanging with them, is that it would not only capture the more tangible elements, it would not only quantify, but I think an important part of the environmental harms associated with drug production are intangibles. And that's a little bit of what I was trying to say here, is the changes in the culture, the changes in how we approach nature, how we regard nature. And this is something that Nigel mentioned in the beginning when he was talking about the problem of demand, where things are seen as commodities, right? And then nature is only seen as a resource. And then when drug production takes over a region in the countryside, that also changes the way people see nature. So it's not only kind of the physical changes, but it's also part of the environmental heritage of that community, of the environmental culture, or what we have sometimes called the indigenous ontologies, indigenous environmental ontologies, how people perceive nature. So I think in that way, that approach of connecting with indigenous peoples would help both understand a little bit more the impacts that in tangible ways, but also in cultural intangible ways.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you very much for those insights. And yeah, no, it hadn't quite occurred to me that probably is, people very, very specific specialisms to exactly measure the impact of chemical waste from productions going into the soil, etc. It's not as simple as measuring a square mileage of rainforest decimated. There's a lot more to it, and really, really interesting points about the soft and intangible factors, which we shouldn't try and measure. We should probably just try and listen. Unless I don't think Nigel has another follow-up to what David had said then.
Well, there's just so many directions you could take this. On the one hand, I think there's an awful lot of promise in from an academic point of view or a scientific point of view, interdisciplinary working. David and I are big fans of interdisciplinary working. I think you are as well, James. And I think Rob White's written a little bit about this in terms of forensic studies of what he calls toxic towns. And it's bringing together the traditional techniques of forensic studies with a green kind of criminology perspective, which just means an appreciation of nature, being more holistic, trying to sort of understand the impact. One of the ways I got into green criminology in the first place was an interest in public health. It wasn't to do with criminology at all, it was to do with public health, because so many of the things that damage public health are criminal, or should be, bad air, bad food, bad water, and so on and so forth. So there's lots of interesting directions in which you could go to just try and say this is a public health issue as well as a crime or whatever issue that affects people in all kinds of communities around the world. You know, and we know that people test the Thames for traces of cocaine, they test banknotes for traces of cocaine. You know, there's testing of all kinds going on. So yes, the techniques are there. And then, as David says, some of the best allies are the people who live there, and that's true again, whether in the global north or the global south. But again, there are colleagues who have recruited indigenous people as researchers with water testing equipment, with photographic equipment, to become the monitors and provide the evidence and give testimony about what's happening. I think Burkhard van Solange and Damian Zich, who both in Utrecht, have done this. David's worked with communities about gathering evidence, and as he says, we tried some of this. So, you know, there are ways to try and do this. Resources would be very helpful. Again, does the appropriate amount of assistance and research money or public health money go to help do this kind of work? Possibly not, because it's not necessarily going to be high on some people's agendas, funders' agendas, but anyway. So I think it's a very interesting area to look at.
Thank you. And it sounds like one where we could do with more development. It sounds like the tools for measuring and understanding this can be further refined, or at least we could do with knowing more of the picture to try and measure and value the harms that are done. I will move to a couple more questions in the chat. We have another two from Carla Cyril. Actually, as well as a question, Carl Cyril made a point that coca can only be grown at high altitudes, and if it wasn't the case, the Dutch would have started already. Quite fun, I do know a Dutchman who reckons he has successfully grown a coca plant in his garden, although I guess the level of care and attention that one plant needed might not be replicable on an industrial scale. But another two questions from Carl Cyril. So if demand is such an issue, would making less harmful drugs for people and the environment better accessible be a solution? Also, if it's hard to change demand, could ensuring that other production methods are promoted over growing coca and cannabis? For example, synthesizing both of these is not that hard, just made very difficult due to a lack of legal precursors. What does David think about the new coca plant found growing in Mexico? That has a very different isotope profile, unlike coca grown in South America. A reference there of Casale and Malete. Is bioengineering coca and growing it elsewhere a positive? I will put that back to David.
Thank you. Big question. And I think I don't have many comments on the new coca discovered in Mexico, but I do want to talk again about this idea of producing more, or bioengineering, for instance. And I think that also, I really enjoyed Eva's question, and I think that also connects with her question about, you know, how to deal with this, what kind of solutions we can find. And then I would find, because if we think about producing more, or if we think about bioengineering, that connects again with the issue that Nigel mentioned first, which is the issue of biopiracy. It's again about making this a commodity, and many times when plants on biodiversity are transformed into commodities, as it has been happening for a long time, and it's always happening at a swifter pace all the time. That has different repercussions. First, one of the first repercussions is that the product or the plant or whatever it is taken off the hands of the local inhabitants, right? So that's what has happened in the case of biopiracy and different ways of being biopirates, of appropriating different environmental resources, and that would then impact the lives again of the rural populations in different ways, not just because they are excluded somehow from the production of a product, but most likely because if it's a commodity, then people need lands to crop them, and then people are displaced. So then again, we have the same dynamic of colonialism in a way, of this marketization of a product that has all these repercussions in countries in the global south. And that again would perhaps satisfy the consumers in the global north, but then we have been talking about these differential impacts across the world. So we might, produce more, satisfy some, but then again, the impacts in terms of genocide in the more cultural sense, in the sense of removing a way of living, a culture, and then the consequences in terms of genocide, as I have been trying to explain, would be the same. And to me, I wanted to connect that with Eva's question, because to me, one big part of the problem in many different realms, not only these plants, but also the term that I was trying to remember at the beginning was this of trauma economy. So the issue is that many things, or most things in our societies, are commodified. Everything has become a commodity, and that transformation has many harmful impacts over societies. So to me, as usual, there needs to be this cultural change in the understanding, in our approach to drugs. But of course, kind of the economic part is always present. But to me, this changing the approach of how we see nature, the resources that come from nature, and how we approach them is quite important. And living in Norway, I see this a lot, how people consume cocaine and other drugs without ever thinking where they come from, and that's kind of that cultural reflection would demand some sort of global imagination, global empathy. And I think that that's an important exercise, not to mention for the time being the economic structure, but I think that changing the understanding would be very important. And I don't think the further commodification of these resources would be the way to go, probably.
Thank you very much for that, David. And so Nigel, related to that, do you think there is a possibility of less ecologically damaging growing techniques, and a way that some sort of regulation could help that be? Would you ever be a proponent of looking at synthetic alternatives which might be less environmentally damaging? And I guess this kind of leads into the idea of, is the idea of fair trade cocaine, or even a cocaine of a soil association stamp on it to say it's eco-friendly coke, do you think that is a reality that could ever happen?
Well, the last part of the question kind of changes the rules. I mean, if there was a move towards some kind of fairer international global trading system that had fair trade and better rates of pay and all of the stuff that you might want to see in a more just and equal system, then subject to seeing the detail, many of us would support that, because these markets aren't going to go away, as various colleagues in the chat have shown, and anyone who knows the field will know. But you'd want to see the detail and who was really benefiting. It's not that fair trade always has positive outcomes or beneficial impacts for communities or whatever. But it's the synthetics that's the interesting thing, because there are things that we might suggest are questionable or possibly damaging, but they're probably going to happen anyway, because it's at the moment a market-driven global system, and as David and I have talked about in relation to biopiracy, biosynthetics, the power of the big pharma and big agriculture. These are global forces that shape the world, shape human societies, what we eat, drink, consume, our body shape because of our diet and so on. And the power of biogenetic engineering, because it's also one of the kind of future industries that people will bank on, it's really very attractive. So there'll be lots of money, lots of science, lots of risk-taking. And so I think that this is an area which will see synthesis of various kinds of synthetic cocaine or whatever in different ways. Now, of course, the legal system in various places has to catch up, but again, talking about, as James and I were at a conference about drugs, talking about dark web markets, or indeed any drug markets dependent on the postal system. Things can be legal or illegal, but if they can get through the post, it doesn't really matter. They'll come through your door. They'll come through your door. So I think there will be more of this kind of synthetic production over time. Whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, again, debatable. It depends how you could impose controls, which might be difficult. There might be fewer old-fashioned drugs wars of the kinds that's been so murderously damaging to populations and cultures and economies around the world, particularly Latin America. But you still have environmental and health impacts, impacts on nature. If you think about soy, which was discovered as a product that the global market needed, and soy exploded. If you think about palm oil and the impacts that that's had. So I think such things will happen. They'll be controlled by the big corporates, which isn't necessarily a great prospect. And I think there still will be environmental damage. But there again, I tend to be old and grumpy these days.
Excellent. Thank you very much for those insights. And relating to your points there, Carl Cyril Drew linked us to fairtradecoke.org, which he says his friend Janneke founded. So for more insights along those lines, visiting that link could be very interesting.
Can I interrupt you, James, to mention
please
something about that? And it's a couple of experiences here. So in Colombia, there's this organization called COCA-NASA, and it is an organization created by these NASA indigenous people. For the NASA, they have been consuming coca for centuries, and it's a very important part of their spiritual life. And they have also tried to enter this market for coca-based products. So they have coca tea, they have coca beer, they have coca rum. They are very creative in producing this. The NASA people in Colombia, they live mainly in the Cauca region. That's center south, roughly, of Colombia. And what has happened here is that they run their territories in an autonomous way. There's this indigenous territory, and they have their coca crops, and the idea was first to destine, part for own consumption, but also for these products that they sell, and you can find them in their website. It's called cocanasa.org. But what has happened recently in the past years, and this is something that we have learned through our contacts or colleagues living there, is that drug organizations, drug cartels enter, and then they offer more money for those who are cropping coca if they sell their crops to them. And then they are not always that nice that they entice them with money, but that they also threaten them. So they are they are using different methods, and they are taking more and more of these lands for this. So of course, kind of in this way, I would not go for the bioengineering for, for the experience we have had with other products like corn and rice and so on. So I would not be, I think this is a nice initiative of selling these coca-based products. But then again, kind of I'm pessimist in this sense when we think about the different structures around the market, both when it comes to the illegal actors like the drug cartels and so on that keep running and keep controlling territories, and also because of other companies that can easily co-opt the market and take over, and these organizations are not able to compete with them. And that has been, by the way, the experience with the different initiatives for fair trade when it comes to coffee. Many times I love coffee. I think we most scholars love coffee, and we feel at ease when we see, oh, it's fair trade. But when conducting my research, my fieldwork in Colombia, many times what I have found is that the fair trade is between a organization in Colombia, Brazil, or whatever, and the consumer in the global north. But the trade is not that fair between the organization and the peasants, the campesinos who are cropping the coffee. So it might sound very nice on paper, but then the treatment or the agreement is not entirely fair when it comes to the local level.
Awesome, thank you very much. So I think as we're getting towards past, we're at a time when we can start to wind down. So I've got one more question I want to ask. And so while I'm asking that question, please post any further comments or questions, or forever hold your peace. Okay, so we've got one from Steve Clare, actually. So Steve Clare says, with so many interested parties in the vast monies generated from cocaine and other drugs, the markets, will there ever be genuine will to direct influence community demand? No, will there ever be genuine will to direct consumer demand towards ethically produced drugs? So I'll put that one. So yeah, so do you think there will ever be enough consumer demand to make an ethical cocaine economically viable? And then I will then the question can go to Joe after that.
I'm sure there's lots of consumers who would like ethically produced drugs, but they don't produce them. That's what Dan has just been talking about. Who controls the land, the market, the conditions, the people, the chains? It's unless you're growing something in your own hothouse, and that's not straightforward these days. Control over the production process is not easy. No, that's the key.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Anything on that question, David, before I allow Joe to ask her question?
I think kind of if we see what is happening with other commodities, and both edibles, coffee, and so on, or even clothes and etc. Of course, there's a growing interest, but at the same time, there's people who, have all these economic pressures, who try also to distance from thinking about that because it's uncomfortable, because they can save money. So it's always, as Nigel's saying, there's always, of course, this interest by some to get ethically produced products, but then again, there's another group that is not that interested in that, and then again, the rules of the game are against the possibility of that fairness, and that has to do with many elements here. But there's a lot of studies about how unfair the rules for global trade are, both legal and illegal, right? So I think that complicates a lot the landscape.
Great, thank you very much for that. So now.
So sorry, James, I just was looking at the question in the Q&A, but I see it's been answered. I must have been not concentrating. But I just want to say thank you for those websites, because I'm just having a look at both of them, and they're really, really interesting. really, really useful information for everybody here. Yeah, it's great. I'm learning loads. It's really interesting.
Awesome, thank you. So before I ask my one final question, I will say as well, I put my email address in the chat. So if anyone would like to see the lecture slides or get any other related resources, email me, or if you just simply want to connect and say what you do, in case we might have some synergy in the future, please do drop me an email. No, just for the final question before I allow our experts to go, is we've been focusing on cocaine today. In the chat, there's been something about ecstasy waste going into the drains in the Netherlands. I wonder, from your studies, what are the other really big ones? Because I must admit, I know nothing about the damage of opium growing, for instance. I have wondered about the electricity demands of indoor cannabis growing. I imagine the chemicals used for amphetamines aren't the nicest to put down the plug hole. But I'm wondering if between David and Nigel, you have anything else, and what are any of the other, what are the other ones which are perhaps big issues in terms of environmental harms and illicit drug production, use, transport, disposal? So actually one thing also we haven't talked much about, crop eradication, which is an attempt to reduce supply, which ends up with its own environmental harms. But yeah, I don't know if anyone has got anything to say on any of the other environmental harms related to illegal drugs. Sorry, oh yeah, Nigel, you want to go first?
No, I think David was going to make a move there. It's depressing, isn't it? I mean, very little that doesn't have an environmental impact. I like a pint of beer myself, but that will have its own impacts. Heroin and derivation from opium poppy involves some similar processes. They involve chemicals. It's got its own history that also involves wars, conflicts, severe exploitation along trade routes and so on, colonialism and so on. And so you could find some kind of parallel staging posts in the problems with heroin. You answered your question yourself about other kinds of production that are heavily reliant on domestic use of chemicals or energy. I guess most will involve some kind of use of energy. So it's difficult to find any positive suggestions there. The eradication issue, again, as you say, if one can find suitable substitute crops or activities, which has been tried repeatedly in Afghanistan, Asia, elsewhere, Latin America, these are generally not very successful because one of the attractions of most plant-based drugs is they're easy to grow, cheap to grow, relatively less intensive in terms of farming. You can do something else. Most other products take a lot more attention and a lot more water. Water is often a resource that's very precious. Might take more water, and they might take more land. It's plant-based drugs. As somebody was saying, growing things up the mountain, side of a mountain. Quite a lot of things don't grow up the side of a mountain. It's actually very efficient to be able to grow things up the side of a mountain. There's lots of reasons why these drugs are quite efficient. These plants are quite efficient things to grow. So yeah, it's a difficult question, finding alternatives.
Yeah. Actually, to build on, someone else in the chat just asked something about do we know if cannabis growing is damaging? Because I have an example with a native population controlling cannabis production by sustainable growing techniques, having little to zero impact to environment. But I guess maybe that kind of boils down to a lot that growing a plant isn't per se harmful. Intensively growing it at vast amounts in a mass industrial way, basically always will be, whether it's your can of beans or at the the most harmful side, it seems, your coca and other forms of, I guess, intensive and careless extraction from the ground. And we could have a similar thing, and I'm sure as green criminologists have talked about illegal mining, etc. When it's done intensively, off-piste, carelessly, then it will be harmful, damaging. David, your rapid nodding of head makes me think you have a point to inject here.
No, I just want to say that I fully agree with that. And that's connected to what I was saying before about these intangible harms, that intangible environmental harms, because everything that's cropped as a monoculture produces all these harms that you're describing, James. And that's part of the logic that has come both with the legal and criminalized products, this idea that to supply more and satisfy the demand, you have to just crop one product at a time. And that has been happening with products like coffee or corn or whatever, but that's also happening when it comes to coca plantations. So we have seen that in indigenous communities that, they used to crop coca to have coca, but they used to crop it together with other products, and then it was a more sustainable or more kind of a healthier way of cropping. But now that they have to supply this huge demand that is always increasing, that's creating more and more harms, because it demands more land, it reduces biodiversity, it leads to deforestation, it leads to soil exhaustion, or whatever the term is. It also requires water and so on. So that's why I was nodding rapidly, because I fully agree with your insight there. And also regarding the other question, I was thinking about this other kind of further away harms related to drug, kind of further away environmental harms related to drug somehow. And I want to also make a small advertisement here, because the book that I wrote with my colleague Katia Franco is about to come out, and it is called Victimhood, Memory and Consumerism, Profiting from Pablo. So basically the idea is what we do there is to study how shows like Narcos, produced by Netflix, and many other movies about Pablo Escobar have also made of him a sort of hero, an icon, a cultural icon, right? And it's about a lifestyle, if it's about an approach to the world, a way of seeing reality. We describe there the kind of the many visitors who go to Medellin, mainly from Europe, and they want to live the Pablo Escobar life. And the Pablo Escobar life was this very male consumerist life with a lot of excess, right? So what he had was this collection of cars. He was a big fan of James Bond. He was a fan of Al Capone. And that was a lifestyle of consuming a lot, of using cars. It's kind of the equivalent of Andrew Tate now, kind of the most toxic way of masculinity, just use and consume as much as possible. But also this, you may have heard about his zoo, his animal collection, that's also connected to these environmental harms. So it's an entire culture that can build also around this commodification and the way this person has become an icon, a cultural icon that has that brings about all these representations of reality that lead to both consuming and to also seeing nature as something that you have to dominate. And the example of his zoo is quite visual in terms of other more distant but still connected harms, environmental harms, and drugs. Yeah.
So I mean, that's an excellent topic, and I think great to finish up on the Escobar hippos, perhaps deeply symbolic. His favoured zoo animal has since taken over, since it turns out there is no predator that can deal with a hippopotamus in the Amazon rainforest. Yeah, hugest thanks again, Nigel, David. Really, really pleased you could come here. And I look forward to being in touch with you all Have a lovely weekend, everyone.
And you, see you.
Cheers.
Thank
See you.